if somebody just told me, like, this isn't going to make you into a boy, and there's no guarantee that doing any of this is going to resolve your distress. You're perfect as you are as a woman. The issue isn't your body, it's the way that you think of it. And no matter what you do to yourself, what drugs you take, what surgeries you get, you're always going to be a woman, and you are enough. I wouldn't be dealing with any of this right now.
Did anyone say that to you? Chloe, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I've admired you from afar, I think, for the last maybe almost year since you started really being public with your advocacy. So I'm excited for the conversation today. So first off, I think you and I have a lot actually in common, being we're both from California and similar areas. So tell me about where you're from and how you grew up.
Yeah, so I'm from the Central Valley area of California. I'm from Manteca, and born and raised there. Never really been out of the area.
And what was life like growing up for you?
I mean, I'm the youngest of the 5 kids. I've got 2 older sisters, 2 older brothers, and so I kind of had influence from both sexes. But I was kind of in between on being like a girly girl and a tomboy in a lot of ways. Like, I liked playing dress up with my older sisters and pretending that we were characters from shows, and I loved when they would put makeup on me, and I stole like their Bratz dolls and their Barbie dolls and stuff. And I also liked playing video games with my older brothers and playing outside and getting dirty. I have always kind of been on technology, using the internet. And part of that is I kind of struggled a lot socially growing up, especially as I got older, hit puberty, and went into middle school. I was bullied quite a bit in elementary school, and after one school year, when I finally managed to make friends, I was back at square one because I had to move neighborhoods and then move schools, and that was when all my older siblings started to move out. There's a pretty significant age gap between me and my older siblings, about 7 to 8 years. So for a lot of my childhood, I was kind of almost like an only child, and so I just turned to the internet.
And what was the internet? What was that like, turning to the internet? What happened?
I mean, when I first started, before I got a phone, I got my first computer when I was about 9 years old. It was a pre-built like gaming computer that my dad had for a while, and it was just kind of sitting around. He didn't really have any use for it, and so he just decided to give it to me. And I like doing artwork on there. I started with Microsoft Paint and a mouse, and then eventually one year for Christmas, I got a drawing tablet. And I was really into communities having to do with artwork. And I also I played video games on my PC, and I watched streamers. And I mean, I was kind of a nerd, so I really liked stuff like that. And I was really interested in online communities having to do with stuff with that. So when I got my first phone, I mean, everybody else my age was using a cell phone. Many of them had gotten phones as young as like 2nd grade.
How old were you at this time?
I was 11.
Okay.
And now everybody's using social media apps like Instagram and Snapchat, and so
yeah, like
I wanted to
kids.
see, I wanted to see what I was missing out on. So of course, I decided to make my first accounts on those platforms. And Instagram was the one that I used the most. It was the most engaging to me because, I mean, it's very image-oriented, and because I like browsing communities around, like, art and the shows and anime that I watched and manga and video games that I played. And that was actually my introduction to the trans community. It wasn't right away. It wasn't directly into the LGBT community, but a lot of users in these communities were people who identified as LGBT, and especially like transgender or non-binary. And many of those individuals were girls around my age, anywhere from like 12 to maybe like their early 20s. And these people were quite like me in that they were kind of nerdy, had always been on the boyish side from a very young age and often feel like they didn't really fit in. And there were posts they would make that were sometimes just not really related to the media that they were fans of. It was about like their personal lives, and I just felt like I really, in some way, that I connected to these people.
Had you known anyone like that in school, or had you ever met anyone like that?
No, I knew there was a girl I knew who was a lesbian, but other than that, it was really new to me because I heard the word transgender a few times being used by like adults in their conversations or on the TV, but I never really cared about it until it was in my face.
So what was the moment when you first began to think, well, maybe I'm transgender?
Yeah, I mean, I was 11, 12 years old, so I was already at a point in time where naturally I started to wonder about what I wanted to be in the world, who I was, and what my role would be. And at first it started with, well, I've always kind of liked girls a little bit, so maybe I'm not entirely straight. Maybe I'm bisexual or pansexual. And then eventually I just kept switching between labels, trying to figure out which one felt right. And it wasn't just about my sexuality or who I liked now. It was about my gender because, I mean, I never really 100% felt like the other girls. You know, I had different interests from them. I acted differently from them, and I felt like I even looked differently from them. I had some body image issues. I started developing at a really young age. I was around 8 or 9, just going into 4th grade when my breasts started to visibly develop, and I had to start wearing bras. And that was a really difficult thing for me to adjust to, especially at a young age. I grew up with older sisters, so sometimes I would see them watching shows, or like they would have magazines around that were very like, I would often talk about things like relationships or like having how you look. And so from a very young age, I was very cognizant of things like that. And I often felt like I just couldn't match up to these images that I would see in the media. And social media was really exacerbating that, especially on Instagram, where there's a lot of images of girls wearing a lot of makeup, wearing bikinis, in very sexualized poses and in situations. And on one hand, I didn't really want to be like that, but it was also like, if that's what being a girl is supposed to be like, why aren't I like that? I just don't think I match up to other women. And I mean, I thought that all being a woman had to offer was just hardship, because that was all that I was taught. I would always hear about how terrible periods are, how scary the possibility of getting pregnant and then actually being pregnant, and then how painful childbirth is, and then how scary menopause is, and other girls' accounts of being sexually abused or assaulted or stalked growing up. And it got to the point that I was like, well, is something like that going to happen to me when I'm an adult? Is this all that being a woman chalks up to? If it is, then I don't want any part of that.
It's a pretty bum deal if that is all it is. And why would anyone want part of that?
I thought it was.
So you're online, you're seeing this other, you're seeing people that say they're transgender online doing part of the art that you love and video games and things that you're already interested in. And you're having this sort of interior maybe conflict about what it means to even be a woman. So what happens next?
Yeah, so as I dove further and further into the trans community and saw what it was all about, I wasn't really, up until after the beginning of my medical transition, I wasn't really interacting directly with any individuals within the community. But I started seeing things about how people have sexed brains. How if somebody experiences gender dysphoria or even acts more like the opposite sex, then that very likely means actually that they have a brain that is more like the opposite sex, and that is what's making them feel that way or behave that way. And, I always felt like there was something separating me from other kids my age, and especially other girls. And the more I read up into it, the more it made sense to me. And eventually I just felt like there's just no way that I could be a girl. I think that I was actually supposed to be a boy this whole time. And I'm gonna start pursuing that. And
did you feel very unhappy during that time? Like you said, you wanted to figure out as an 11-year-old, like what's my role in the world, or what is my future like? Did you feel like a deep discontent or unhappiness or anxiety, or what was that feeling like as you were having that logical progression of, well, if these things don't add up and this is what this, research says, then or these people online are saying, then this means that I must not be a girl. But what was going on inside your I guess your emotions in your heart?
I was at a new school. I'd been there for a few years, but I just didn't really fit in, and it was kind of cliquey. And I didn't really have a lot of close friends, so I was kind of lonely. But I feel like that's pretty normal at that age. I think most kids that age feel like that.
So after you went through this sort of thought process, what did you do with the conclusion that you reached?
I'm a boy. But I believed that I was actually a boy, and that I was actually my parents' son and not their daughter. And so I started pursuing that, and I started to experiment a little with my expression, started cutting my hair shorter slowly over time. Whenever I'd go shopping, I'd start going for the boys section more often. And it wasn't unusual for me to do that, but I was starting to get rid of all my skirts and dresses and pinks and bright colors and swap it out for a more masculine wardrobe. And I started telling some of my friends, my closer friends at school, that I was going to transition, that I wanted them to refer to me by a new name, by new pronouns, and as a boy. And most of them actually responded pretty negatively. The love bombing didn't really come right away. The affirmation didn't really come right away. And I actually got bullied for it a little bit. There were a lot of people who picked on me for it. But I waited a little bit to tell my parents about it, because I was scared of how they would react. I didn't know if they were going to be supportive of me doing this. But I knew that if I wanted to go through transition, I couldn't keep them in the dark for long.
What was it like telling your parents?
It was something that I'd been wanting to do for some time, but I just wasn't sure of how they would react. I didn't know if... I'd heard stories from other transgender people about their parents almost hating them after they told them that they were transgender. Even some kids getting kicked out or moving to a new home and just being in a really rough home situation. And I didn't really expect anything like that out of my own parents. I knew that they would love me still, but it made it a little bit more tense. And so I decided that I would write them a letter so that I didn't have to bring it up face to face, that I could give them some time to think about it, because I knew that as a parent, that's got to be a hard thing to hear from your own kid. I don't think anybody would really expect that. So I gave them some time. I just told them that I had something important to tell them that I had left on the coffee table, and I was looking forward to how they would respond. And when they read it, they were supportive at first. They wanted to be supportive of me and to help me get through this. But at the same time, they were also very cautious. And they didn't really know where this feeling was coming from. They didn't know what to do about this. So they decided that, I mean, we're not experts on this, so we're going to get a professional involved instead. And we're going to get you a therapist.
And did you go to a therapist?
Yeah, I did.
This was the first time you'd been to therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I've been to a psychiatrist before as a kid, and gotten diagnosed with ADHD before, but not like a personal therapist or anything like that.
Did you feel like you still had ADHD at this point? And how was that affecting you?
I mean, I didn't doubt the diagnosis for a while. I was a kid who was pretty inattentive in a lot of my classes. I often just skipped out on my schoolwork and didn't really pay attention because I just didn't really see any meaning in doing any of it. And I had really bad organization skills growing up, and it's still something that I kind of struggle with. But I also had some social difficulties growing up, which I've heard is common for people with ADHD, but it was really hard for me growing up. And I think part of it is that I was so heavily pathologized as a kid that I just accepted that all of my hardships came down to clinical issues. But I think now that the ADHD diagnosis was actually false and that I'm actually on the spectrum, but they just refused to diagnose me with it. Almost like the word autism is too scary to say out loud. Like I had a screening for it when I was about 4 or 5 because my teachers in preschool and kindergarten noticed that I wasn't really interacting normally with other kids and that I was kind of just aloof and in my own world. And I had some symptoms of it that they told my parents, like, you should probably get your kid, you should probably get a screening for your kid. And they did. And the physician just told them, I think your kid's too smart to be on the spectrum. She's very smart. She's very smart for her age.
It's so crazy because so many autistic people with autism can be so smart.
Right.
And so that's just kind of a weird thing to say.
Yeah, I had a second series of screenings when I was 17 years old. And it was pretty much the same response. Like, well, you're really well-spoken and you're really intelligent. It's not impossible. It's a possibility, but let's wait a little bit.
What blows my mind with all of this, and we're obviously going to get into like what happens with this crazy thing that you endured with Kaiser and all of that, but even what you just said earlier, you felt pathologized. It was like very insightful what you said. Like you felt pathologized as a kid, I think were the words you used. And I think our society is so unable to deal with just people that are just different. Like we have this expectation of the way you have to be. So if you just act different socially, because I grew up homeschooled. I grew up as kind of like, a nerd among nerds. My dad, my mom jokes my dad might be on the spectrum, things like that. And it's like, I don't know if that's a joke, but because he's just highly bright and a little bit, interacts socially just different than other people. And just like all this pathologizing of kids just because they're different when everyone's different in different ways, right? So not to like overgeneralize, but I think we do our disservice to kids and,
absolutely,
and authentic diversity, like diversity of personality and talent by making medical issues out of all of it, calling it all a medical issue.
Yeah, and I was also diagnosed with disruptive behavior disorder.
What does that mean?
Well, for me, I mean, I really struggled with making friends, and I was getting bullied quite a bit in elementary school, and I would often take it out physically on my bullies. I would often hit them, or, like, push them to the ground, like, throw things at them. I would often throw tantrums in class, and I didn't really know how to emotionally regulate myself, and I would take it out externally. I guess.
How old were you?
I was, I think, like 5 to 8 years old when I was like that.
Do you think if you hadn't been bullied and if you had been in a learning environment that was more suited to you, where you weren't feeling bored all the time, you would have, this is obviously a huge hypothetical, but you might not have acted out as much?
Absolutely.
Because you were just forced to sit in a classroom with your bullies.
Yeah.
And you're like, this is boring.
Yeah, that was a big
bullied.
part of it. I didn't really feel like I had much of a community, and I didn't, because my older siblings were so much older than me, like I felt like I just didn't really have anybody to relate to. And growing up, I felt like there was something wrong with me. Like I thought as a kid even that I was evil, and that's why nobody liked me. It probably also didn't help that they started medicating me for my ADHD diagnosis when I was about 10 or 11. And
what kind of medication?
It was they started with long release medication, but they're constantly switching me between meds, like different doses, different medications.
To try to get you to what? Do your homework?
Yeah.
You just didn't like your homework.
I didn't. The screen was more entertaining.
It was boring.
I'd rather draw or play video games. I had
should have been homeschooled, Chloe.
I had sketches all over my schoolwork all the time, and I always get in trouble for it.
Because you're an artist.
Right. And sometimes my teachers would even get me in trouble for it. Like I would get like a perfect score on a test, but I would draw something silly on the side of it, and they would just give me a 0 for it.
No way.
Yeah. And I also wasn't allowed to draw outside because it was dangerous to have a pencil out of the classroom.
What school did you go to?
I won't name the school,
okay.
But
it was a public school?
Yeah, it was. And it was kind of
California.
Yeah, it was kind of out in the country, but it was one of the oldest schools in the district, and they were kind of stingy, very cliquey.
So you weren't allowed to color outside, or to draw outside, meaning if you wanted to take your art notebook and do sketching of a tree, you weren't allowed to do that?
Yeah.
Because? Why?
Because it's dangerous to have a pencil. What if I get stabbed in the eye?
And how old were you?
The school that said that, I went there from 5th to 8th grade.
So you're like 11 years old.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. So you're going through all this, and you're basically feeling like you're different, understandably so, because the world is asking you to be this particular kind of person that fits in this very rigid academic category, and even, I would say, gender stereotype category, because you were saying it was magazines and makeup and this idea of like women are this way, and because you're not that way, then maybe I'm not a woman.
Mm-hmm. And eventually I did end up liking those things, but I mean, for a while I just didn't want anything to do with those things. And there's still a lot of, I feel like in some ways I still have some traditionally more masculine leaning behaviors. And it's just one of those many things that made me feel like there's something separating me from other women. Like I was just watching from the outside while other women I felt like they got to interact with each other and relate to each other, and I didn't feel like I was that way at all.
So were you looking to fit in somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you thought, I have a better shot of fitting in with the boys than the girls?
Yeah. I mean, I also struggle to socialize with boys a little bit, but sometimes I found it easier to relate to like boys' sense of humor and a lot of their interests, and even the way that we felt about the world.
Yeah, I think boys in a way can be easier to get along with. I remember growing up, I mean, obviously there's a lot of differences, but I had a lot of brothers, and it was like for a while I didn't feel like I knew how to interact with girls until I kind of figured it out. But because I didn't grow up with sisters, I didn't have a sister till I was 9 years old. So
yeah, growing up, I had a kind of offensive sense of humor that a lot of girls just didn't really like at all.
Meaning just jokes that were not.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
not
off-colored.
We're not, that's very funny. From like being 5 years old, off-color jokes. Were there? Did you have a favorite joke? Do you
Not a
remember- do you
particular
remember
favorite
any of
joke,
your jokes
but
being 5?
I remember in kindergarten, up to like first or second grade, we would have assignments where we would learn about important historical figures, and we'd have to like color them in. I'd draw like Band-Aids on their faces and like give them nose.
Give them noise what?
Give them like running makeup, blushing, nosebleed.
Oh no!
just random stuff. Just like
And your teacher's like, she's definitely a boy. Did you save any of that artwork? I feel
It's probably somewhere in my closet.
That's pretty hilarious. Okay, so you're just a very funny, quirky girl who's like tough and figuring out and smart and figuring out her place in the world. And then you end up with this therapist. Well, you went to the psychiatrist, who gave you the meds as an 8-year-old because you didn't like to sit in your chair all day in this boring school. And then you end up, I'm not making fun of it. There's an absurdity to the way that our systems don't make space for diversity, quite frankly. Diversity of personality and talent, I would call it.
Yeah.
Anyway, but then you tell your parents, okay, I must be a boy, and you're seeing this stuff on transgender stuff online, and you go to this therapist. Tell me what happens there. And how old are you?
Yeah, I was this was just before my 13th birthday. So I was 12 going on 13.
And by the way, you've started puberty already because you started early.
Yeah.
So is that very uncomfortable? I know for me, puberty was very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was
didn't know what
about 3 to 4 years in already. And it was really uncomfortable because there is like that stress of developing early and like knowing that other people can see these changes and that they'll have whatever thoughts about that. And then feeling like I have to look a certain way and meet a certain expectation. And also, it's hard as a kid dealing with that sort of change and so rapidly.
Did that come with a feeling of shame?
Yeah, absolutely. On one hand, it was like, I'm really excited to develop and look pretty, but I also felt like that just wasn't happening, I thought that my life was over because I didn't look like a supermodel at age 12, you know?
It's so toxic what the supermodel weirdo culture has done.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the age of like...
Because you're on Instagram, right?
Yeah,
So
I grew up in the
dealing with
age
that.
where you're expected to be thick, curvy, have the big, voluptuous body, and I just wasn't like that. You know, I was skinny, kind of on the athletic side. My breasts were they're a little bit on the smaller side, and my hips weren't very developed yet. And I mean, I was just a kid, but I didn't really understand that. But I also liked having my hair short, and I had bigger shoulders, a little bit of muscle. And sometimes people would like make comments about like how muscular I was. And I was really conscious of that. And I felt like I didn't even look like a woman. But I had been through several therapists over the years. The first one I had was especially lousy. He just didn't really...
This was after you told your parents, I think I'm a boy?
Yeah, I didn't realize how much these body image issues were bothering me.
I mean, I think, and for the women listening, I want to hear what they have to say in the comments about their experience with this. Because for me, as a teen girl, when I first hit puberty, probably 11 years old, or maybe 10 actually, I started. But I remember feeling so much shame when someone told my mom, oh, Lila needs a bra because my breasts were developing. And instead of it feeling like, oh, this is a beautiful thing and every woman's body is unique and I need to uniquely embrace mine, there was just like straight up shame. And when my period came, shame. And that's not the way it's supposed to be or has to be. And I'm not saying it's my mom's fault or my parents' fault. I was the first daughter. They were figuring out my mom, her experience of going through puberty growing up wasn't like, you know, done in maybe the best way. And so there was just this inability to like know how to deal with it. And so I developed an eating disorder because I started to hate my developing body. It didn't look the way I thought it should look. And so that's part of my story, and people can, I've shared it before, but so I relate to those feelings. Obviously, you have additional things going on too, but it's a vulnerable place to be in.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't say that I was shamed for it, really.
People didn't shame you.
Right.
But you still felt shame.
Right, I still felt that.
And I don't think people shamed me either, but you feel ashamed because you don't know what to do with this experience.
Yeah, my parents never really had, like, the talk with me growing up, and I feel like if they just talked to me about it and they taught me about it, it would have helped greatly. Like, I know that's a really uncomfortable, almost kind of like compromising situation for both the parent and the kid, but it's important. Like, growing up isn't comfortable. And there's, like, the parents who, like, who are hush-hush about it, thinks it's shameful. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's, like, the adult women who are like, oh, it's such a beautiful experience. It's going to feel great. Like, and you should be proud of it. You should put it up on a billboard that you're having periods and free bleed and whatever else. But
maybe it's somewhere in between.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be objective about it. Because it's not going to feel great, but it's a necessary part of becoming an adult.
And it's beautiful because it can bring your puberty, once you've sexually developed, can bring life into the world. Right. It can lead to, like, all of these beautiful things.
It's all for a good reason.
Yeah. And it's not supposed to have shame, but shame can be part of it because we're in a broken world navigating how to deal with our own emotions. But
it's just a part of our design.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very, like, realist and mature and loving view, because it's actually, like, seeing the humanity of the person and their biology and accepting it instead of over dramatizing it in one way or the other, basically. So what happened with this first therapist that you went to? What did you tell them? What did they tell you?
Well, I mean, once gender was brought up, and that was my focus because I didn't really realize just how much the other things going on in my life were affecting me. It was like, oh, okay, so we're going to focus on that. What's your preferred name? What's your gender identity? What do you identify as? And what pronouns do you want us to refer to you as?
So did the therapist explore with you whatsoever your discomfort with puberty and, like, just the process of becoming a woman? Because you're going through puberty still. I mean, your body image.
Yeah, now as a boy, I was feeling uncomfortable with the fact that I had a feminine form and that I was skinny, and I wanted to have more muscle. I didn't want my breasts to be visible, and I didn't want to have any curves whatsoever because I just wanted to look like all the other boys my age. And they were like, okay, so you have distress around your secondary sex characteristics, and you feel like you don't really fit in with other girls. You've always felt like you've been more boyish. So
there was there was no exploration, I guess.
No, not at all.
There was no exploration of other issues you had even as a child, your experience of being just different and challenged in connecting with most girls and many boys. It was more just that you came out to this therapist, you said, I think I'm a boy or I am a boy. And
it was just accepted as fact, yeah.
And they didn't even, but it's curious that it's one thing to just accept it as fact. It's another thing to accept it as fact and not be interested to understand how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah. I mean, the things I would tell them, like around my discomfort around my body and not really fitting in, it was just accepted as part of me being a boy, of my destiny.
I find that peculiar. I'm curious your thoughts on this because it's almost like this, to say, for a young person to say, they're a girl and they say I'm a boy, or they're a boy and they say I'm a girl. And the evidence for it is that they think it. And that they're uncomfortable with their body, right? And then the therapist or the psychological, the medical community just accepts it as a fact. It almost feels like a sort of like religious belief in this destiny belief that the child has or the person has. Like their destiny is.
I think that's what it really comes down to, honestly. The belief in a gender identity isn't really too dissimilar from a belief in a soul, in that it's like this innate part of a person, or innate, I should say. Yet it's disembodied. It's not actually a part of the body, and yet somehow it influences who the person really is.
Yeah, it's a belief in a soul, in a different kind of soul that hates the body that it's been given. And then the therapist chooses, and the medical community chooses to listen to this soul as opposed to the reality of the body and the person in front of them. So what happens next?
Eventually I became dissatisfied with my therapist because I had stuff going on at school and at home that he just wasn't really addressing at all. And
Like what?
I mean, I had all my electronics taken away for some time. And
By your parents?
Yeah.
Why?
It's happened so far back, I can't really remember the specific details.
Not doing your
But
homework?
no, I think it was because I had I had online friends, and I gave some of them my number, and I guess like I got a text that was associated with some, I don't know, it was just some name that my dad, he just woke me up one day asking like who this person was and why I was messaging them. And I didn't know who he was talking about. I guess it was like an old number associated with a different name. But I didn't want him to know that I had friends online, that I gave out my number to them. And so I was very adamant about not letting him check my phone. They just decided to take it away.
Because were they afraid? Do you think that you were talking to people that were maybe predators?
Probably, yeah.
Do you think that's a valid concern?
Absolutely. I mean, I could have been in that situation. I actually was a few times over the years.
In what situation?
Speaking to predators.
How did you find out they were predators?
I mean, I think a better way of wording that would be...
Weirdos?
Yeah. I mean, there were a few people online, inside and outside the trans community, that I had like online relationships with, and many of them were much, much older than I was.
That's a predator.
Yeah.
And your parents kind of were onto this a little bit, and so they're like, we're just going to cut this off.
It's actually happened quite a while before that actually started to happen.
Are these men that you were?
Most of them were.
So you're a girl who's having all of these other issues, things you're experiencing. You're having these online relationships with these older men who are basically preying on probably your vulnerabilities on the internet. But you still thought you were a boy at that point.
Yeah.
So did you think you were a gay boy?
Yeah. I just, I mean,
Did they think you were a girl or a boy?
My parents?
No, the people, these older men on the internet.
Well, they just affirmed my identity and just went along with me calling myself a boy.
So they knew you were a young girl who was struggling with gender dysphoria. And did you know anything about them? Do you think there was a particular sort of psychological type you were talking to that found you particularly attractive because you were going through this?
I mean, it was all sorts
struggle?
of different people, but a lot of them were identifying as LGBT. A lot of them called themselves like gay or bisexual. Some of them were trans-identified males. And
what does that mean?
They're trans women. They call themselves. They're biological males who identify as women.
So a biological male identifying as a woman who is attracted to a young woman identifying as a young boy. So it's still biological male to biological woman. But
it's just a very roundabout way of having a straight relationship, basically.
It's a lot of work for a straight relationship. So how old were you when you had your first online relationship with somebody who was much older, and how much older approximately were they?
I was probably like 14-ish, 13, 14. And a lot of them weren't necessarily like relationships. Some of them were just like short, I guess you would call them flings, or like I would just like exchange like sex or like nudes with them.
And how old were they?
Anywhere from like my age to like late teens, maybe early 20s.
Okay.
There was actually one person he was in his mid-20s and he was in the military.
Okay. And in most of those cases, it was all different kinds of men, in like some men who identified as women, but otherwise just some of them were just
For the most part,
men.
it was just men.
Okay.
And a lot of them would call themselves like gay or bisexual, but
Because you thought you were a boy at the time.
yeah, yeah. I think that they kind of did that to lure me in a little bit, to ease me a little bit, by affirming my identity, but they were still attracted to women, and it was just part of their ploy to exploit me sexually.
Have you heard of Autogynephilia?
Yeah,
What do you think about it?
it's kind of it's a very open-ended question.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that do you think that affected you, or do you think that it affects a lot of people who struggle with gender dysphoria?
I mean, I probably, to an extent, had like a female equivalent of it, which I guess would be called Autoandrophilia. I mean, I was mostly attracted to men, but sometimes I would have like fantasies where that involved women, and that I was the male in the situation, and that might have been part of it. And I think that's really just like a normal part of, I wouldn't want to call it like exploration or experimentation, but I wouldn't say that's really something that's like clinically significant. But I also had researched like medical transition and taking testosterone a little bit, and I really liked imagining the way that I would look on testosterone. I liked I was looking forward to like having more muscle and looking more masculine and having some of the changes of testosterone on my body. But none of that was really explored. Like they would ask like what my sexuality was, who I was attracted to, but they would never really factor that into how that might affect my gender dysphoria or my desire to transition.
They meaning the therapist.
Yeah, and I was still mostly attracted to men, but I was just too young and too deluded to know how this would affect my ability to get into a relationship with a man. Nobody had really brought that up with me.
Meaning, for you to transition, and we're going to talk about what those exact steps were for you, but for you to transition, it was never really discussed what that would mean in a future relationship or even a marriage to a man.
Yeah, I mean, my endocrinologist told me, like, well, you might experience vaginal atrophy. She told this to a 13-year-old, expecting her to know what that meant. And what I knew of it was, like, okay, it causes the walls, the lining of the vagina to thin out a little bit and dry out a little bit and not produce as much lubrication. And it might cause some pain if I were ever to have sex. But that's okay, because I could just use lubrication, or if it got bad enough, or I could prevent it from getting bad enough by taking topical estrogen at some point.
To counteract the testosterone.
Yeah, yeah. And it only affects that area of the body. Maybe like a little bit of the estrogen would get into the bloodstream, but not enough to really affect the rest of the body. But I did that. I wasn't informed that this atrophy actually would affect the general pelvic region. And I started getting really bad cramps in my uterus from time to time. And the topical estrogen made that go away for the most part. But I was also having some issues with my urinary tract, and I started getting a lot of infections. And sometimes I would even get like blood, or towards the end of my transition, tissue in my urine.
From taking testosterone?
Yeah. And it got worse for a little while after I stopped taking it. It's gotten better since, but I still have some issues with my urinary tract. Like, I don't really get infections or anything like that anymore. No blood clots, no tissue, but it's still kind of difficult to like fully like empty my bladder, or I have to use the restroom a little bit more frequently than the average woman. And I was also told that it might affect my fertility. Again, I was 13. I wasn't thinking about having kids, so it was just like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have kids. And if I wanted to in the future, I mean, I could just use like a surrogate or IVF, right? Because I thought it was that simple. I thought those technologies were flawless and that there would always be another option for me.
Did they explain what that really meant? Like, this could kill your fertility, so that means you will never be able to bear, carry, gestate, deliver, birth your own child?
No,
there was never a discussion of that.
She didn't really go into detail at all. And before my mastectomy, I was told, like, I'm not going to be able to breastfeed my kids ever. But I was living in the mindset of being a male. Why would I want to breastfeed a kid, right? If I wanted to be a father rather than a mother. Because what father does that? That's the mother's role. And I'm not a mother.
But you still were attracted to men, right?
Yeah.
So if you got married, in your mind, maybe you were thinking, well, I would marry a man.
Yeah.
So
As I got older, it was like, well, if I were to have kids one day, what would they call me? It would kind of confusing to call both parents dad. I mean...
And you thought you would just have someone else, a surrogate. You'd have a child through IVF and surrogacy.
Yeah, I thought they could just... I wanted to have biological kids still, but I thought they could just like extract the eggs from my body and then implant it in another woman's body, and it would just be that simple. Because I was naive. I was an adolescent.
Yeah, how old were you when you had a double mastectomy?
I was 15.
Okay, that's such a crazy thing to so many people listening. And who did the double mastectomy?
I had it with a surgeon and my healthcare provider.
What was the healthcare provider that approved this?
Kaiser Permanente.
Okay, which one? Which Kaiser?
The hospital that I underwent surgery at was in San Rafael, so in like the Oakland, San Francisco area.
It's so crazy because I have family that has used Kaiser in that area. And I've been to Kaiser in that area because I used to live in the East Bay. What year was it when you had the double mastectomy?
It was 2020.
So during COVID?
Yeah.
So they were doing so they were delaying, hold on. During COVID, they were delaying like knee surgeries for people in chronic pain because of COVID.
Right.
But they were giving a 15-year-old healthy girl double mastectomy.
Yep. This was in June, so most of the lockdowns were only barely starting to open back up again. And they also...
I mean, women who delivered children during that time couldn't even have their husband in the room.
What? That was a thing?
That was a thing.
I knew about the knee surgery thing, but not...
And you had to wear a mask the whole time. I mean, you couldn't... If someone was dying, your loved one was dying in the hospital, you couldn't go see them. But they gave a healthy 15-year-old girl...
Right. Anything considered
mastectomy.
Elective or unnecessary wasn't done during this time. But apparently this was necessary. It was life-saving care, they said, even though they did examinations of my breast tissue before and after. And when they actually looked at the tissue afterward, after taking it out, they... I remember in the appointment afterward, they told me specifically that there weren't any signs of cancer. And even though that wasn't the reason why I underwent the surgery, it was just part of the protocol to tell me that. So I was perfectly healthy. It was healthy tissue that they took out of me.
Do you think about, was that now, from the vantage point that you have now, looking back on that, is it traumatizing to think about?
Absolutely. It's horrifying. Like, I just shouldn't have been able to, this shouldn't have been an option for me. it hurts knowing like I could have just grown up without any intervention, and I could have been completely normal. And I wouldn't be dealing with all of the stuff that I am now. I'm having some pretty serious complications from my surgery, on top of all the trauma that it's caused me. And if somebody just told me, like, this isn't going to make you into a boy, and there's no guarantee that doing any of this is going to resolve your distress, you're perfect as you are as a woman. The issue isn't your body. It's the way that you think of it. And no matter what you do to yourself, what drugs you take, what surgeries you get, you're always going to be a woman, and you are enough. I wouldn't be dealing with any of this right now.
Did anyone say that to you?
I mean, there were times when, growing up, when my mom would tell me, like, oh, I was a tomboy too. It's okay. Like, eventually I grew up and I'm the way that I am now. So you'll probably be just like me. But I was a kid, and there was still something, even hearing stuff like that, I still felt like there was something wrong with me because I still had a lot of other stuff going on. I thought that this was the only answer I had, and it was the only one that was presented to me.
So the first therapist you went to immediately starts the affirmation, which in the state of California, my understanding is you have to affirm.
It's the one legal approach.
And the word affirm is so deceptive. Because affirm what? You're not actually affirming them.
It's a delusion. We're just letting them believe that there's something that they're not.
And it's not just a delusion, though. It's something that it's a roadway to severe harm. It's a lifelong path of medical intervention. So what was your first experience being put on testosterone? How soon after you tell your parents you're a boy, you go to the therapist? How quickly did they put you on testosterone?
I'd say maybe like 2 or 3 months after I was formally diagnosed with gender dysphoria was when I started telling my parents, like, I really want to get hormones. I really want to go down. I want to become a real boy, basically. And that was when they were starting to get really, really suspicious. Like, why do you feel this way? What is it that's making you feel like you have to be a boy?
So your parents were asking you those questions.
Right. Why do you feel like you have to go down? Why do you feel like you have to take these treatments? Like, you're really young, and you might not know what you really want. And we don't want you making permanent decisions at the age that you are. But I just kept pushing and pushing, and they were really concerned. So they went to my doctors, and they were like, why is she pushing so hard for this? Why does she want to do this so bad? And don't we have another option? Like, why does she have to go down this path at such a young age? Why can't we just wait until she's 18? And what's the likelihood that she's going to regret this if we don't? And my doctors were like, I mean, it's not normal for kids to, I'm sure you know as a parent, like, it's not normal for a kid to push for this so much. It's clear that she knows what she wants. I mean, if you don't affirm her and her identity and allow her to make this decision, if you don't let her transition, it's very likely that she's going to kill herself.
So your parents, who sound like they were trying to deal with the situation as best they could, and they were concerned, this sounds quick and soon when you're, how old are you, 12 at this time?
13. You're
13 years old, and they're asking the doctors, and is this a psychiatrist that you're talking to or a psychologist? Who first told your parents that, basically a threat to your parents, that Chloe will kill probably themselves. I don't know what pronoun they used, or himself. I don't know the name you were using, but
Leo.
If you don't let Leo be Leo, meaning get these surgeries and take testosterone, then Chloe will basically die.
When they told me about this, they only told me about this recently. I didn't know that this happened until after I stopped transitioning. And the way that they spoke about it, it sounded like there were multiple doctors that they were speaking to. So I'm assuming it was a gender specialist and maybe like a nurse in the room.
So they went to talk to a gender specialist because they just didn't know what to do, felt in over their heads. I mean, probably felt very overwhelming for them. This is also during COVID, right? Or is this before
no,
COVID?
this happened before
This was before COVID
started medically transitioning.
Okay. Because the mastectomy was during COVID, early COVID.
Yeah.
And they're basically told that their daughter could die.
Yeah. It was made out to be a
themselves.
life or death situation.
And so what did your parents do after they were told that?
They were sold into it. They really didn't think there was any other option because they weren't given one.
And so then after you start testosterone, what happens next?
About a month before I was put on testosterone, I was put on puberty blockers to stop my body from naturally producing any hormones and just clearing them out to make way for the exogenous hormones. And that was really tough. It was a chemically induced menopause, actually. So I was experiencing like hot flashes, itching. I was very lethargic, very sleepy throughout the day. And it just wasn't a pleasant experience. And I really just wanted to move on to the next big step, which was testosterone. And so after that month or so long period of being completely devoid of sex hormones and almost kind of sickly even, it felt great to finally have some hormones back in my body. And it was androgens, so it felt pretty amazing. I mean, I felt like I was on top of the world. It really helped to boost my confidence, and my energy levels were back up and better than ever. And I started to feel almost sort of like a competitive streak. And
like a competitive streak, like I'm going to crush this being a boy thing.
Yeah. It did. I also, it was like to me, it was like a big step. So naturally I would feel pretty giddy about it. I also had a pretty steep increase in my libido, which was pretty difficult for me to deal with.
Had you already at this point had your period?
Yeah. I had only been having them for about like a year by that point. I started getting periods when I was about 12 years old. And it was so early that my cycle hadn't even regulated itself yet. And I also didn't know that there was more than just one stage in the menstrual cycle. Like all I knew is that there's a period and then that's it. Somehow you can get pregnant. I didn't know how that worked at all.
No one ever told you?
No. And none of my sex ed classes ever addressed it. I learned what ovulation was from a meme when I was 16 years old.
What did you learn in your sex ed classes? How to have sex?
No. It was really bare bones, honestly. Like we learned about gametes, and then the most we were ever shown about sex was like, don't have sex. We're not going to explain why, but you can't have sex. Don't do that.
But there's
then they showed us like a video of a woman giving birth and like pictures of genitalia, both male and female, infected with STDs. But they never explained why things like sex are so important or intimate, or
even fertility, how your body works as a woman, or a man's fertility, how that works.
So I was being expected to make decisions around things like that I didn't even understand yet. And they didn't make any effort to explain those things to me.
So there was no informed consent?
Absolutely not.
And how can you consent when you're a minor in the first place?
You can't.
So you're on testosterone. When did you decide you wanted the double mastectomy?
Well, I was about between like 2 to 3 years on testosterone. Um, I had been using like a binder through that time. I started using one after I started taking testosterone. And if you don't know what a binder is, it's kind of like they come in either half body or full body, and it kind of looks like a tank top, but in the upper part of the garment, it's like a compression area. And they work by basically pressing the breasts into the upper body to make it look flatter. And on one hand, like, I didn't really want to be seen without it on under my shirt because I didn't want anybody to know that I had breasts because I wanted everybody to think of me as a guy. And I already did look like a male. Testosterone was pretty effective on me, and I passed considerably well as the opposite sex. I actually had a much deeper voice than I did now, and it was deeper than most of the boys that I was friends with throughout high school. So it would be really weird for this person who looks and sounds just like a guy to have this very feminine looking area of the body. But I was also very uncomfortable in it. Like it fit well. It didn't really cause me any pain per se, but I heard like from other trans identified females like how they would experience pain in their back, in their upper back, in their breasts, in the middle of their chest, in their rib cage from using one. I never got any of that, so I thought it was just fine, but it actually distorted my rib cage a little bit. And even now, it's been 2 or 3 years since I've used a binder, and I still see like the little, I wouldn't say like dents, but the bottom of my rib cage kind of flares out a little bit because I used a supposedly safe and reputable brand, but these things work by pushing the breast into the rib cage. And especially if you're developing, there is no safe way to go about that.
It's like the foot binding. It's just it's
now it's just binding something else
to fit into the society, to kind of fit, basically in order to fit in to society's expectations as you're experiencing them
in a more backwards way even.
So you're doing that, but what made you decide to get the mastectomy?
I just got really sick of doing it after a while, and I started to think of myself as being just like any other boy. And I wanted to be able to take my shirt off like all the other boys without worrying. And I also had an incident in 8th grade where I had been sexually assaulted by somebody who had been bullying me for transitioning throughout the school year. And I didn't really realize just how much it affected me because I was already transitioning by that point. I was already in the mindset of actually being a boy. So it was like, well, I just have to be tough about it. I can't be too upset about this. And
so wait, a guy, another 8th grade boy?
Yeah.
And he sexually assaulted you. I mean, how can you share? Obviously, I can only imagine how traumatic it was. So whatever you're comfortable sharing.
He groped me. He just walked up to me in the middle of the classroom and he squeezed my breast. He looked me right in the eyes as he did it. And
were there other people there?
Yeah, the classroom was full, and yet nobody did a thing about it.
That's horrific. Was the teacher there?
Yeah, he didn't see what happened though. And I was afraid to report it to any staff members because I was afraid of getting in trouble myself. The school I went to just sucked, and they failed to accommodate me throughout the school years. I had an IEP in place that they just refused to abide by, and at one point they even told my parents, like, it's our responsibility to help the child and not you. And I didn't really have a lot of friends there, and I was even among like the teachers and staff members. I wasn't really I wasn't like a favorite kid by any means.
Do Do you
And I
think,
felt like if I did report it, like they'd probably just let the kid off with a slap on the wrist. And I didn't know like if he was going to come back after like a few days, after a week, and if he could potentially do something worse to me if he did. I just didn't want to, I didn't want to try it.
do you think there's any connection between being groped, having your breasts groped as a teen girl who's going through gender dysphoria and all these other things that you're going through, and getting the mastectomy?
That's why I started binding, actually. I didn't use a binder up until that point. That was what triggered it for me.
To protect yourself.
Yeah. It was
You
like,
were
I don't,
literally putting on kind of like an armor.
yeah, I mean, I knew like at one point I wanted to start hiding my breasts, but I just kind of put it off because it was like, well, like I'm not as developed as some girls, right? And I wear like baggy t-shirts and sweatshirts anyways, so nobody's really gonna care. Why would they care? Like they already knew me as a girl, like they already know like I'm biologically female. So why would anybody give a crap about that? And then that happened. It was like, okay, I guess I'll have to start hiding this part of me sooner than later.
I'm so sorry that happened to you. Did your therapist know that happened to you? Were you able to share that with anyone?
No, I didn't tell any adults about it.
Did any of your therapists ever ask you about any kind of sexual abuse or sexual assault?
They probably did at some point, but I didn't even recognize this as a sexual assault. It just didn't register to me at the time that it was. Because when I thought of sexual assault, I would think of like all the stories I heard from like other girls and women growing up of being like raped or beaten. It was nothing of that sort. Like something worse could have happened to me. It wasn't the end of the world, right? So,
but he's publicly squeezing your breasts to
right.
mock you and shame you. And no one's intervening or doing anything. And what happened next? He just walked off?
Yep.
So after you get the mastectomy, what happens? How did you feel?
I mean, in the immediate moments after, I actually woke up a few times before the medication fully wore off, and I would try to stand up a little too quickly, and they made me lay back down and go to sleep a few times because of that. And I almost
after the surgery.
I almost threw up a few times because of that. But once I was like fully awake and fully conscious, and like I was aware of what just happened, it was the greatest thing in the world. Like I finally look like a real boy now. Maybe not right now. I mean, I've got these big scars across my chest and these skin grafts that are going to take some time to heal, but eventually I'm going to be just like any other boy, but I'm going to have these warrior scars on top of it. And I'm finally going to be able to take my shirt off in the locker room and not have to wear a shirt, not have to cover up while I swim or go on a jog or work out. And it's going to be great from here on. And I mean, that was a very convenient, very happy way of looking at it, but that never happened. I'm still healing.
What do you mean?
I mean, I've had some issues with my skin grafts over the years. At first, the skin grafts I used were my areolas, so they took them off, and the way it was described to me, I guess they said it in such a way to make it easier for like a teenager to digest, but it was like, okay, so we'll take your areolas off, and then we'll scrape the skin on a part of the chest, kind of like a deep knee scrape, but more controlled, and then we're going to place the areolas onto that area, so it's in a more masculine position, they said. And at first, the grafts seemed to be healing okay, other than the fact that they were superficially they were a little bit dry on top. But as of last year, around this time, they did a 180 and they've started to leak fluid.
Do you know what that means? Have you talked to a doctor about that?
I've tried. I mean, I went back to my surgeon for the first time in a few years, and I tried to get his help. I got like a 5-minute Zoom call with him, and that appointment was for two purposes. One, to report that I regretted the surgery, and two, to get some help with my complications and maybe figure out whatever is going on. And the whole time, it felt like he was being really rude to me, really dismissive of my concerns. And I was telling him, like, I'm having to bandage my chest every day so that whatever this fluid is doesn't get onto my clothing and bedding. And he just told me, yeah, keep doing that. Yeah, that's normal. Just keep bandaging it and put some Vaseline on it to keep it moist.
This is how many years after the surgery?
2 years.
So it's been 2 years since the surgery, and you're still experiencing this.
Yeah, my grafts were supposed to be mostly fully healed by around 1.5 years. And
did he have any explanation for why it was happening?
No.
Zero. He did this to you, and he didn't know, he had zero clue about why, and he just said, perpetually bandage yourself.
Yeah.
For a wound that I created.
Yes.
On a 15-year-old girl.
I didn't.
What a butcher.
I tried to look up whatever's
human
happening.
Butcher.
Yeah, I tried to look up whatever's happening. I never had heard or seen anything like this before.
Can you name who this surgeon is?
His name is. He has an Asian name. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but I think it's Dr. Lei Hope.
When did you first start doubting your transition?
I didn't really have like any doubts about transitioning up until after I had the surgery. So for the longest time, I was very confident in presenting myself masculinely and calling myself a boy and being seen as such. And it wasn't until after my breasts were gone that I started realizing, like, wow, sometimes I miss being pretty. I wish that I could grow my hair out and wear makeup without being judged, because now everybody thinks I'm a boy. And if I were to do that, I'd get called all sorts of names. People would call me gay. I'd probably get harassed for a little bit. There were a few times when my girlfriends put like nail polish on me, and I would go to class, and the boy next to me would be like, "Why are you wearing nail polish? Why are you wearing earrings? Are you gay?" And like
But
if I were to
wouldn't you have considered yourself gay because you were still attracted to men, right?
Yeah, I was, but I didn't want to be seen that way because, I mean, even though I live in California in a pretty, I guess you'd say, progressive time, in high schools especially, like there's still that stigma against people who are gay, or even people who say are male but they present themselves more femininely, or vice versa. And I just didn't want to deal with that. So
what process did you go through before eventually deciding to detransition?
Eventually my feelings around that started to go into a downward spiral, basically. I became more and more distressed over the way that I looked every day, and I hated that. I no longer had soft feminine features. Now I had muscle and big shoulders, and my breasts were gone, and I thought that I wasn't bothered by my mastectomy for the longest, but I just wanted to be pretty and have curves in other places and to be effeminate looking. But I started comparing myself again to other women and feeling like I just didn't match up. And I was also comparing myself to other men as well. And I realized, like, I'm pretty short. I'm like 5'3", 5'4", which is like a pretty average height for a woman. but that's way shorter than the average male. So that would be kind of strange. And now that I was presenting myself as a guy, I mean, I wasn't bad looking, and there were quite a few girls who thought that I was attractive, but I didn't really have any attraction to them. And I felt like even if I did want to pursue a girl, I'm not actually a biological male. I don't have the parts that they're looking for, and I don't want to disappoint anybody. And the few boys at school who were attracted to me were not the most savory of people. A lot of them were like really into drugs, or like it kind of felt like I was almost like a fetish to them. Like I looked like a boy, but I was small, of a short stature, skinny, and they didn't really see me as much more than that.
Do you think pornography played a role?
Yeah, probably.
For those boys?
That's probably part of it.
Did it play any role, do you think, in your transition?
Yeah, it really distorted my view of like sex and intimacy, but also my own body. And it's gonna sound kind of funny, but BuzzFeed and other publications like that really made that a lot worse. Because I first discovered like BuzzFeed and other like those kinds of sites through like when I was a kid by looking up, I don't know, like which Disney princess am I? And then they have like all those quizzes, but then they have the other less appropriate content on there, especially about things like sex. And from those, there would be articles like encouraging like teenage girls, like younger and younger, to explore their sexuality and what they like as early as possible. And that things like casual sex or being kinky are good, and we should all strive to be that way. And none of it really discussed like the real meaning of sex, about the intimacy of it and why it's so important,
and how it's designed,
right,
for intimacy and pleasure, and for also life,
right. And it was really like pleasure above all,
and pleasure without love, which in the end doesn't bring pleasure, like long-lasting pleasure, which I would call peace or joy or happiness.
Right. And my distorted view of sex and relationships, on top of my inability to get into a relationship because of my transition, I had a lot of stress around that, because all my friends were starting to get boyfriends and girlfriends, and I was missing out on that, and I felt like I was a freak or something, like there was something wrong with me. And so I compensated by getting into those online relationships, by sexting older, often random men. And it all worked to make me feel so much worse. And it was difficult socially for reasons other than romance. Now it was a lot harder to make friends, to be as intimate as I could be as a girl, because now I was taking on the role of a boy, and there wasn't really a lot of room for me to talk about like my own personal hardships and what I was going through. And all I really had was the internet.
At what point did you decide I'm done with this?
At some point, it was like, well, I never felt like I was enough when I was a girl, but I feel the same exact way as a boy now. I guess I just can't be good enough as either. So maybe I'm not either. Maybe I'm just non-binary. Maybe I'm something between the two sexes. But no matter what I did, no matter what I called myself or what pronouns I used or how I dressed, I just kept getting worse. It wasn't up until at some point late in my junior year that I realized just what I was doing to myself, that it was making things worse, and I couldn't go back. And that was when I started to learn about things like motherhood and parenting, and how children's minds develop and how they see the world. That it was like, wow, I didn't know all this. That's really important to me. And I want to be a mother one day. But how am I if I'm on these medications that might affect my ability to have kids? And now that I can't breastfeed, I just realized how important that really is. That breasts aren't just a sexual object, that there's so much more than something to be played with or to feed a child with. Because even breastfeeding is very important to the bond between a mother and her child. And things like, breast milk, it has things like pre and probiotics in it that help a baby's immune system develop. And breasts and physical affection in general help to regulate a baby's body temperature and other parts of their health. And I'm not going to have that anymore. I never will. And it was taken away from me before I even got to become a woman, before I understood what that meant. And that really horrified me. I couldn't keep living like that, because now I knew what it really meant.
When you had that realization, what did you do?
Well, first I went through a few weeks of just the most horrific distress and not being able to focus on anything, really. I cried quite a bit, and I withdrew pretty much completely. And then I finally came to terms with the fact that I'm still a woman, and nothing could change that. And I was still kind of stuck in the mindset of I could just identify out of whatever I was feeling. So I was still kind of wondering, like, well, what is my identity now? But now my transition was over for good. And I told my mom, I told a friend of mine, and I just didn't know what to do with myself for a while. I grew out my hair, I started buying new clothes, but...
Did you stop taking testosterone?
Yeah, I took my final testosterone shot almost 2 years ago at this point.
And
in May of
how old were you?
2021. I was 16.
Do you know if you're able to have kids?
I haven't gotten a fertility test yet. I got my period back about 2 months after stopping testosterone, very quickly. And my periods seem to be regular now, which is a good sign. And now, like, based on like the symptoms that I'm experiencing at a given time, like I can tell which part of the cycle I'm at. It's a possibility that I could be having anovulatory cycles, but I think I'll be able to conceive a kid. I just don't know if, like, how basically skipping half of puberty might affect other parts of that, like my egg quality, whether my hips have expanded enough to safely, naturally give birth.
But you started puberty blockers several years into puberty.
Yeah.
So there are obviously detransitioners who they had puberty blockers before they even had a puberty. So I think that, I'm going to pray and hope for that for you.
Thank you.
What's next? I mean, well, before what's next, what's now? Because you're doing some incredible things. We were just joking earlier about the New York Times is after you this morning.
Oh, that was beautiful.
It's so beautiful when the media, when one of the biggest papers in the country writes a hit piece on me.
I can't say when I started doing this a year ago that I expected anything like that, but honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Well,
It's kind of fun.
The way that getting to know you a little bit, the way that you take it in stride is awesome. It's definitely very warrior woman.
I mean, I've already lost a lot. I wouldn't say like my attitude is like I don't have much more to lose, because I still have, despite what I've lost, I still have a lot. There's still a lot in this world for me. But like I have to get justice for what happened to me, but I also have to prevent it from happening to anybody ever again.
Well, you are already doing incredible things to accomplish that, and it's amazing to watch you do that. It's one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
You're just getting started.
I believe it.
I want to talk about what your goals are with your mission moving forward. But first, the decision for you to publicly share your story, which I can only imagine how much courage that took. You made that decision about a year ago, right?
Yeah.
So it's been 1 year since you've been publicly sharing your story.
Just over a year, yeah.
What was that like to first publicly share your story of detransitioning?
Yeah, I mean, a while after I stopped transitioning, I knew like I wanted to start talking about my story, but I didn't really know where to start. So immediately after I detransitioned, I was pretty much kicked out by the trans community for being an apostate. And
They called you an apostate?
No, but they treated me as
apostate.
such.
Because you violated the fundamental rule of their religion, which is
gender affirming care is healthcare.
And you dared to criticize the surgeon that cut off your healthy breasts.
I mean, before that, I would just talk about the pain and regret that came from it, and how I felt like my doctors lied to me, and they did. And I was told, like, you should have known exactly what you were doing. You knew what you were doing to yourself. Don't put this on us.
But they said that it was your only option.
Yeah, and they
told your
with
parents
with every step, the more extreme it got, the more they celebrated it. Like before, I think.
What do you mean
when I had my
by
mastectomy?
Celebrate? What did that look like to celebrate it?
When I had my mastectomy, that was probably the most praise I'd ever gotten in my lifetime up until that point. Like the most I had was probably like my parents or classmates telling me that they liked my drawings. It was incredible.
So
but now that I regret it, now that it causes me pain, they blamed it on me, and some of them would even make fun of me for regretting it.
Well, I just want to unpack that for a minute, because I think that's such an incredibly important experience that you had, which is that in your entire life, the thing you'd most been praised for was your art until you had your mastectomy. And then this whole...
And starting on testosterone and the other parts of the transition process.
So the thing to affirm about your identity, your humanity, most for other people became that you were on these medical treatments.
Yeah.
And then when you chose to stop the medical treatments and expressed regret, what happened? What did they do? What did they say to you? What did they say to you online, Chloe?
There was this one person, also a trans-identified female, who I had known since I was about 13. And I think this person had always been jealous of me because I had a loving family, and I was able to get on these treatments so early. And they weren't always the nicest to me, but they did celebrate my transition, especially my mastectomy the most. And now that I was regretting it, they were trying to like gaslight me into thinking that we had a conversation about the difference between body dysmorphia and real gender dysphoria, whatever that means. I don't think it's real, personally. And they even told me, like, you were 13. You weren't a toddler. You knew exactly what you were doing and why you wanted it. I knew at the same age that I wanted to transition. So why wouldn't you? This is your fault. Doesn't it feel bad? Doesn't it hurt having your breasts be gone? Forever. And
Meaning they still had their breasts?
probably, yeah.
It's pretty twisted.
It was one of the most deranged interactions I've ever had, actually, because at some point, after taking out all that whatever on me, they started crying to me about how they had been sexually abused at a young age. They were so close to seeing why this is affecting them so much, why my regret was affecting them.
So
I think it's so clear that this individual had, like, their sexual trauma was influencing their decision to transition, and that's why they didn't want to be a girl anymore. And that's I see that quite a bit.
They were angry that you were regretting it.
Yes.
And confidently, in a way, regretting it.
Yeah, and I got the same kind of reaction from a lot of other individuals in the trans community. It was all from, like, older transgender people, many of whom hadn't even started on hormones yet. And I was supposedly in the most ideal situation to transition. Like, I was super young, and I had a supportive family and friend group around me. I passed as the opposite sex very well. I was pretty much indistinguishable from a real male. And yet, it still hurt me. I still regretted it. So as somebody who wants to live that kind of lifestyle, there's that sort of cognitive dissonance in, like, being told, like, this is life-saving healthcare, and that is the most ideal way to do it. And seeing somebody who had been through exactly that, having been hurt by it.
You shattered their cult.
Very closely. I was very close to. But after a while,
the response is anger against you because you're daring to reveal the
I think
truth.
It's very based in fear, yeah. So after a while,
It's kind of like and this is a real phenomenon, when people join cults then leave, they become anathema. You know, the cult members have a profound hatred and disgust for people that leave their cult, the ones that stay.
Yep. I mean, after a while, I'd been harassed so much.
What did that harassment look like?
Sometimes it was, like, random people DMing me stuff like, you looked better as a boy, or, like, you should have stayed a boy, or keep that to yourself, you're disgusting. Sometimes, like, random people, like, stalking me, like, leaving mean comments on my posts, on my personal social media. And I just didn't want to deal with that anymore. So I went silent about it for a bit. But I also discovered that there were online communities having to do with detransition, and everything that the transgender community was telling me about detransition was a lie. And I knew there are so many people out there who are just like this.
What were those lies? What were two of the top lies that the trans community, as we can call it, was telling you about detransitioning to try to scare you off from doing it?
That this is rare. That
it never happens, meaning that people regret.
Pretty much, yeah. And that when it does happen, it's usually due to social pressure, and regret is actually quite rare. So I shouldn't talk about my own regret, because then that's imposing my own experience on other trans people. And I actually never heard about detransition at all up until I started detransitioning. I didn't even know what the word was until it happened to me.
How common is it? Do you know?
We have no idea.
We have no idea.
We do not know.
Except if you go on certain Reddit, I mean, aren't there hundreds and hundreds of these stories coming out now?
Yeah, the r/Detrans subreddit was one of my first stops. And then...
How many posts on there?
I don't know how many posts are on there, but there's... The last time I checked, there were, I think, like 40, 50,000 people on there. And it's growing.
50,000 people on the Detrans Reddit.
I think they gain about 1,000 people per month even.
It's insane.
Yeah,
for them to say this never happens, or almost never happens. Would another lie be there's no consequences?
Oh yeah, I mean, I wasn't told that.
Okay.
I knew like there would be consequences to it, but I wasn't at an age where I could really
Comprehend,
fully appreciate that.
So I want to talk about your activism because you are traveling the country. You are speaking before state legislatures, Congress. You are advocating on major media shows. You're leading a crusade. When I first heard about you, I'm like, she reminds me of Joan of Arc, except you're fighting for children, instead of like a nation, but it is a nation to some degree, obviously, the children of this nation and the world. What's that like?
It's, I don't think any one word could describe just how wild of an adventure it's been. I mean, just last year, I was pretty much a shut-in, like a total loser, kind of a stoner. Like, I just played video games all day and just didn't really do much. Like, after I got my, I was studying for my CHSP, which is a diploma equivalent, but I didn't really have any plans for life. I didn't really think that I would make it, honestly.
What do you mean by that? Did you feel depressed?
Yeah, I was really depressed. Like, I thought I lost everything. I mean, I lost all my friends. I went through my senior year completely alone, so I just dropped out. That was why I was getting my certificate in the first place.
This is after detransitioning.
Yeah. I thought I lost everything. But at the same time, there was still something keeping me going. And I still wanted to make friends, even if they were outside of school, and I wanted to do my best to improve socially and maybe one day become a functioning member of society. I didn't know if that was a possibility for me, but I just kept going through, and I started making up with my family because my relationship with them was really strained over the course of my transition. And just like being with like my little nieces and nephews, it helped me to realize just how important that is. And based on my interactions with the Detrans community, like, I wanted to help other people in this situation. And like, I knew there has to be kids going through what I did, because when I first entered that community, it was pretty much only adults who had been through the transition process as adults. But I just had this intuition that there has to be a bunch of other kids like me, even if it was just one kid or 10 kids who are like me. That's far too many. And I wasn't ready for a while, but I knew like at some point I wanted to start speaking up. And I started small. At first it was just on my personal social media. And then once I felt ready, I started posting about it on Twitter. And I didn't really expect my platform to blow up the way it did. But at some point, I had like journalists messaging me or like emailing me. And I had some articles published on me that helped to really increase my reach. And eventually one day, I had a parent working with a nonprofit group called Partners for Ethical Care reaching out to me saying that Louisiana had a piece of legislation that was, I think it was like a conversion therapy ban that included like the gender affirming care model in it. And she wanted me to like write a testimony for it. But it turned out that the state of Louisiana wouldn't accept written testimony, if I were to testify, I would have to actually come there in person. And so they asked me if I would be able to fly out. And I really wanted to do it. I knew it was like a pretty big opportunity for me to do that. But when I told my parents about it, at first they were like, no, you're not doing that. Like,
how old were you?
I was 17. I was still a kid, and I hadn't really been away from them that far away or for so long. So naturally, they were pretty protective of me, especially since I wasn't completely healed yet. I wouldn't even say that I am now, but I was a lot worse off just a year ago than I am now. But it took some convincing on their part, but I'm very glad that they said yes and that I've been able to do this, because it's been a wonderful journey, not only for me, but for the other kids who are being affected by this.
Your Twitter game is also very strong. And you're very articulate and a wonderful spokeswoman in showing the harm, but also advocating for good for children and for families. What are your goals?
Well, I want to stop these treatments from ever being performed on children ever again. And I think the standards of care for both adult and child patients who have gender dysphoria need to be revised, because as it is now, the current model doesn't allow for real informed consent. It pushes transition as the only option, and it doesn't really give these patients the information that they need in order to make a decision on this. They're calling it life-saving care, when really it's only taking parts of a perfectly functional body.
Do you support bans on affirming care for minors, as they call it?
Yes. This should never be performed on kids.
What kind of treatment should they be providing for children who face gender dysphoria?
They need psychotherapy.
Do you think if you'd gotten psychotherapy, you wouldn't be here today?
Absolutely. I mean, I had a lot of compounding issues growing up that I feel like if they were properly addressed, I wouldn't have felt the need to become a boy, to become something that I wasn't.
In the state of California, my understanding is psychotherapy for gender dysphoria without the affirming care model, meaning saying, yes, you are the opposite biological sex, you're not really a man, you're not really a boy, you're not really a girl, is illegal.
Right. I mean,
it's mind-blowing. And if you're a parent of a child who struggles with gender dysphoria and you say you don't want your child to be led down this path of mutilation, puberty blockers, and the rest, then you can lose custody.
Yep. It's abusive not to affirm your child, apparently.
The language is so deceptive because it's not affirmation.
I mean,
it's exploitation.
What is a parent for then, if they're just supposed to let their kid have the reins on their own medical treatment?
Have you been able to talk to your parents about what happened?
I mean, in an objective way, about like what's happened, yeah, but we haven't had like a deep emotional conversation about it. I'm kind of afraid of doing that right now, just because I feel like it would be really deeply painful, and I don't know if if either I or my mom or dad have really recovered enough to have a conversation like that yet. But at the same time, it's like the clock's ticking. They won't be here forever, and I have to have that conversation at some point. It's just a really scary prospect for me.
They sound like they did their best with what they knew, but at the same time, I'm sure it's devastating deep down for them.
They have a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
I think any parent would.
That's a very gracious, you've got a very gracious approach in how you talk about them. So you're going to end this evil practice once and for all, and then what? Once you've ended the evil practice of the medical community that's been poisoned by this ideology, what are you going to do next? It's
such a simple question, and yet it's so overwhelming.
Well, you are 18, so
there's so many possibilities, you know.
Any 18-year-old is like, I mean, the vast majority of 18-year-olds are like, I don't know, this sounds interesting, So you're already like doing something tremendously significant.
Yeah,
so
yeah. I mean,
you've lived already so much life.
Once this is said and done, there's still so many things in this world to fight for. Like, I'd say that over the years I've become a very family-oriented person, and there are a lot of issues affecting children and families and mothers and fathers right now. And I think once I'm done with this, I might continue on to that. But
What are some examples of things you're passionate about? For me, you might know, I mean, obviously with live action, I've 2,500 children killed every day by abortion. It's like these children are in danger of death and I'm going to fight for them. But what are some things that you've seen that you're just concerned about and want to try to stop?
I mean, a lot of parents now are totally laissez-faire in how they parent their kids. Now that's, they go home, they have a nap, they have a drink, they spend time with other adults rather than their own kids, and they're just letting they're letting the screens parent their children rather than themselves. And that's kind of how I got to this point. I learned about transitioning entirely from social media, and my parents had no idea what I was seeing online. And usually it doesn't lead to something this extreme, but I've seen the same thing with a lot of my friends growing up, in that their parents let them have completely unrestricted internet access, and they're exposed to things like pornography from a very young age. I think that's another issue that I'm very passionate about. I think that there needs to be age restrictions on pornography.
I'm with
on
you.
Websites.
I would just ban it. That's my position.
Ideally, yes.
That's a step right there. Wow.
Ideally, yes. But in a state like California, or pretty much throughout the U.S., that would never happen, unfortunately.
Do you want to have a family yourself one day?
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
I hope I have a big family one day.
That's awesome.
But first, I want to travel the world. And outside of activism and politics, I've kind of always been on the artistic side.
Yeah, those pictures of the kid with the bloody noses of the historical figures.
I mean, other than the funny stuff that I would draw in class, I've always liked doing things like character design and illustration.
It's very cool.
And in recent years, I've gotten into fashion, and
You are very fashionable. I love when I've seen your videos and stuff, when you're at a rally or you're testifying, you're dressed like in a really cool, you have a very cool aesthetic that I like.
I feel like the way that I dress in a lot of these interviews and at these higher profile events, though, doesn't really capture me very well. I feel like it's a little too stuffy for me. I mean, I like it. It's fancy and all, but
you're more of a relaxed vibe.
Not necessarily. I mean, I always have some sort of crazy idea. I'm kind of building up my wardrobe right now. The idea I have for a brand is
if you're going to say it, someone listening might steal it. So just proceed with caution. I'm just kidding. My listeners are super good.
It's constantly evolving, but and it's very much a work in progress. I don't have a name for it or anything right now, but the motto I have for it is of future and past, and there would be two distinct styles. One of them would be kind of nostalgic, very bright colors, a lot of cute motifs, and the other would be more futuristic, almost kind of like a cyberpunk. I want to figure out how to do that without it being cringy. But I guess like if you're going to cyberpunk, you're already in cringe territory.
I like it. Chloe, you're an inspiration. I'm really excited to see what you do with your one beautiful life. And thank you so much for sitting down with me in this kind of warm room. Sorry, it's kind of hot, to tell me, and just your courage in sharing so much personal stuff with the world, but so you can help other people and help other children. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
How can people find you and support your work?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at CHOOCOLE.
Nice. And what about, is there like a website to donate or to contribute financially? I know that what you're doing is not free. You have to support yourself. I'm on DonorBox at donorbox.org/Chloe-Cole. Awesome. Thanks, Chloe.
Oh, yeah. And I also have I have an ongoing lawsuit, and the fund for it is on the official Center for American Liberty website.
Nice. Sue them into oblivion for the children.
That's the plan.
For the children. Thank you, Chloe. You rock. I'm so sorry. It's so hot in here. Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah.